There is a handout tonight, and if you do not have that handout on what or where God is when I hurt, raise your hand. Matt's got them ready to give. The scripture that I want to study with you tonight is Psalm chapter 46 and verse 1. Psalm 46 and verse 1. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in time of trouble. That's what He's promised. But sometimes we ask the question, where is God? Slide number 11. Where is God? That question is asked more by modern people than the greatest question of all, what must I do to be saved? More people are saying, where is God? I'm suffering. I'm hurting. Things are not going well for me. Where is God? Where is God? That's the question that was asked, I think, by our nation almost completely on two occasions. This question was asked during the two major national tragedies, Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941, and when the Twin Towers were hit September the 11th, 2001. We call it 9/11. I have a picture of Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise military strike by the Japanese Navy Air Service upon the naval base at Pearl Harbor. And it was just before 8 o'clock Sunday morning, December the 7th, that the attack took place. The attack led to the United States formally entering into World War II the next day, December the 8th, 1941. When the Japanese left, and I am told by some that as they stood and watched those little planes come in with their bombs, that they even waved at the American soldiers, sailors, on the deck of those ships. 20 Navy vessels, 8 battleships, 300 airplanes, more than 2,400 Americans died in the attack, and more than 1,000 were wounded. Franklin Roosevelt, the next day before Congress, said, "This is a date that we shall never forget." During that time, the two are in my lifetime. I was yet to be born the next year, 1942. But I have been told by many that Americans went to church, they prayed because they knew that their boys, young men, would soon go to battle. The next great universal day of prayer and asking where is God was on 9/11. How can any of us forget the early hours of that fateful Tuesday morning, September the 11th, 2001? We must never forget it. We must remember. We remember where we were. Many of us had just poured our morning cup of coffee and turning on the television to watch the morning news. Some of you were turning on the radio to hear Brother Chuck Webster preach that morning on words of truth. But you stared in disbelief as the events of the morning unfolded. How could this happen? How could this happen in our country? How could this be so well planned? It was as if we were watching a horror movie as we witnessed airplanes crash into the World Trade Center towers, watching those towers one by one fall. A tragedy in Pennsylvania and an attempt to harm thousands in the Pentagon in our national capital. Air travel was immediately stopped, and our skies were quiet for the first time in our history as we waited some word from our president, President Bush, to help us make sense of the scene. I have a good friend who loves to make airplanes. He gets kits and he puts them together and he flies his own planes. That's his hobby. And that particular morning, not knowing what had happened up in Washington, D.C. or out in Pennsylvania or in New York, he got in his plane and left the airport there in Elkins, West Virginia, and was flying over the little city of Elkins. He hadn't even turned on his radio. He was just flying around. It was such a beautiful morning. He told me later, he said, as he flew along, immediately there was a little jet plane that came out of somewhere and was almost touching his wing. And he, the pilot in that little jet plane, was motioning for him to turn his radio on. And when he turned his radio on, he said, "Don't you know, sir, that President Bush has said for all planes to be on the ground? Said, if you don't respond immediately, I will blow you out of this air. I will destroy your plane." And that little jet plane ushered him back to the airport and said when he got out of his plane, he was shaking all over. He said, "I'll never forget that day." Where was God on that day? Well, tonight I want us to think about where God is in the midst of trouble. Remember the verse, Psalm 46, verse 1, when he says that the Lord is our refuge, a present help. Where is God when I hurt? I suppose I've been asked this question more than any other question. When I go to the hospital and somebody is suffering because of a loved one is at the point of death, Brother Sides, why? Or when I go and talk to somebody that has just suffered the loss of a child, maybe a car accident. We go to church. We read our Bible. Why is this happening to us? So the question is, where is God when I hurt? This is a hurt-filled world. Somewhere a child is born today with a defect. Someone will hear the dreaded C word, cancer, from her physician. And somebody's loved one will go under the surgical knife. Someone today is weeping beside a new grave, and another is wiping tears off of a picture album. This is a world filled with hurt. An innocent spouse somewhere today is hearing the heart-rending words, "I don't love you anymore." And another is hearing divorce granted. People are weeping today until the fountain of tears is running dry. Where is God Where is God when we're hurt? That's the question. And that question is asked more than the question that we wish people would ask. What must I do to be saved? Well, slide number 19. God is today in the same place He was. And I'm going to mention a number of places or a number of events. God is in the same place when Adam and Eve rebelled in Eden. He was waiting there. Somebody says, couldn't He have stopped them? Could He have not said to Eve again, don't eat of that tree? In the day that you eat of that tree, you will surely die. He said it once, but could He not have said it twice? And could He not have put His hand down there and shook that tree and said, Eve, go back to your home? Where was God when man first raised his ugly head of defiance and rebellion? Could He have stopped it before it began? Oh, it's not a matter of whether or not He could have. It's a matter of His design for humanity and His plan for redemption. He designed us with freedom of choice. In His sovereign foreknowledge, He made provisions before the world was ever created for man's redemption, knowing full well that man would make disastrous choices from the beginning. When Adam and Eve finally fessed up, He was there with a covering. First of all, He covered their nakedness. They had tried to cover themselves by making some aprons of leaves that they had plucked off of a tree. But God He killed some animals. He made coats of skin to cover. But that was not the only cover that God was ready to make. He had to get those people out of Eden because of their sin. But He began that very day to plan a scheme of redemption to cover the sins of mankind. So where was God when Adam and Eve sinned? He was right there where He is today on His throne. Where was God when Noah built the ark, protecting them from a disaster? Sadly, man's rebellion did not end with Adam and Eve. Their sons and their sons' sons for every generation followed in that rebellious way until such time that the wickedness of man filled the whole earth, and that stench or smell rose in offense to the holiness of God. But God found one man, Noah. The Bible says that Noah found grace in the sight of the Lord. Here was a man not perfect, but a righteous man who faithfully proclaimed the righteousness of God, 2 Peter chapter 2. And when God, grieved by man's wicked rebellion, determined to wipe man from the face of the earth by a flood, He further determined to spare Noah and his family, and from their stock repopulate planet Earth. So in mankind's greatest natural disaster, God was on His throne. That's where He is right now. But God was on His throne that day, protecting His own. Where was God when Job lost everything? In fact, God and Satan had been talking. God did not send a message to Job and say, we're fixing to test you to see if you're really a follower. Satan has told me that if I remove the blessings from you, you will deny me, you will even curse me. God didn't send Job that. Job was a successful man. He was one of the greatest men in the East at that time. But one day, everything just collapsed. Where was God? You think Job thought about that? Where was God? I had it so good. I had all these sheep, all these oxen, all these camels. They were all taken from me. And even my family, all of my children, died at once. I know what it's like to have a son and to find him on the floor, having experienced a major heart attack, was dead. I fell on Lee. I tried to wake him, but he wouldn't wake. I tried to give him air, but he wouldn't receive it. He was dead. Oh, if I had my time to go over, when I went by his trailer that Sunday morning on the way to church, when he said, "Dad, I just don't feel like going to church today. You go on and I'll go tonight and take the Lord's Supper tonight." If I really had it to do over, I would say, "Son, get in the car and let's go to the doctor." He was experiencing at that very moment a major heart attack. Just a few months earlier, he had stood by me during my bypass surgery. He needed it worse. We didn't know it. And I tell you, there were some times in all of this that I asked, where is God? Why did he take my only son? God was there that day on his throne where he is right now. I know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. I'm still seeking the good. I know it's out there somewhere. I know that there's some benefit coming. But that was in 2013. This is 2021. I haven't found the good yet. But my faith is strong, and I believe that I will find it, because God never tells that which is untrue. Romans 8, verse 28, all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. Where was God when Joseph was rotting in the prison, in jail? God was on his throne. And even though Joseph didn't really believe it, maybe didn't really know why he was suffering so much from his own brothers, and in jail, having been told a lie on him that was not true, he finally said to his brothers, "You meant it for harm, but God meant it for good." So God is on his throne. We could go on and tell the experiences of people such as Moses, who was on the backside of the desert. He once was a boy that ran around in the palace, but he was being prepared for greater service on the backside of the desert. Did Moses ever say, "Where is God? I'm experiencing so much depression, so much problems. Where is God?" Moses was being prepared for the great work of delivering the people from Egyptian bondage. We could say, Samson, your eyes have been gouged out with a stick. They found that the symbol of his strength was his hair, and they cut his hair off, and his weakness. They made him push the rock around to grind the grain into meal. His eyes, they literally gouged out with a stick. In total darkness now, God was on his throne. He could have stopped that, but he had something greater. Being strengthened in his hour of weakness was his design for that occasion by God. We could talk about Paul, we could talk about Stephen, we could talk about where is God in all of these people's lives. But where is God when I hurt? Well, this little paper. Let's look at it. Where is God? Where is God when we hurt? God is up in heaven. God has a good vantage point. He's up there and he can see all things very well. We're all naked before him. There isn't even a thought that we have that God doesn't know. I'm just amazed at these space machines that are flying around the earth, that our government can so plan and even move them and put them right over Afghanistan and look down and see that there are 6 planes that are still on the airport runway down there. That's amazing to me. But God has an all-seeing eye, and he has the ability because he is up in heaven. And since God is on high, he will not miss seeing what is happening in our lives. Since God has an eye on the sparrow, that's what he taught about in Matthew chapter 10, verses 20 through 31, he certainly will not ignore his child. That beautiful black lady sang that song many years ago. His eye is on the sparrow. God is with us in that he sees and knows and cares. There's a lot of people that don't believe that. Let me give you an example. When I preached at Hebron Church of Christ in Joppa, Alabama, just outside of Arab, the Hebron congregation was much like the Midway congregation. Out in the middle of the country, a congregation of about 200 members, growing and still growing today. That congregation had produced a lot of preachers. Jerry Humphreys, Ray Humphreys, some others. But they did not have elders. Not a single elder had been appointed in all of the history of the church. And so when I became minister, I met with the men, and they wanted me immediately to start a series of lessons on qualifications of elders. Let's appoint elders. We've been a good church, but we've never had elders. And so we went to work. And after about 6 months, 2 men who agreed to accept the work as elders were appointed. But one Thursday afternoon, Brother Latham was coming in from his job at 3M company in Decatur. I think it's 3M, whatever. He had a farm and had a lot of cows. And this old cow was breaking through the fence as he was driving into his driveway. He got out and he ran toward that cow that was breaking through the fence, and he fell with a heart attack on the ground. His wife, in great distress, called me, and I came over. We lived close there, and we called the ambulance, but I knew he was gone. I said, call Pat. We couldn't get Pat because it was a party line, and finally I got in the car with one of the deacons, and we went over, got Pat, and I said, Pat, come with us. What's happened to Daddy? I said, something tragic. And when she ran out of the car, even before it stopped, opened the door, ran down to where Dad was laying on the ground with a white sheet over him now. One of our elders. We had only two. Now the church was without eldership again with the death of Brother Latham. Here's what Pat said. As she moved the sheet and saw that his face was blue, death was there. I hate you, God. She raised her fist and said, I'll never be in church again. I'll never serve you. You took my own dad. She lived up to that word. She never was back in church. And when I was called from Montgomery, Alabama, to preach her funeral, I could not say anything positive about going home to heaven because she gave it up all. Where is God? God is up in heaven, and He knows, He sees, and He cares. God is beside you. A little girl cut her hand very deeply and was rushed to the emergency room. For some medical reason, the surgeon thought that it was not best to use any medicine to put her to sleep. So he asked her, honey, can you stand me stitching this deep cut without medicine? I don't know how a little girl could understand that kind of language, but according to the story, she paused and she said, yes, if Daddy will hold my hand. The Lord has promised to hold our hand. Psalm 16, verse 8, verse 11, chapter 18, verse 38. And then Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. The Lord has promised to hold our hand. God is beside the Christian. That doesn't mean that we'll never have any problems, that we'll never have any kind of fear. We may have as many problems with this. You know, this world is not a Christian-friendly world. It is a Christian persecuting world. You just start out telling people what they must do to be saved, they'll rise up against you. They'll begin to talk about you. And, you know, even Jesus said, and you shall suffer persecution. God is near you. God was near Daniel. You know, they threw him in the den of lions, and those lions were hungry. But before he landed in the midst of all those lions, God went in and shut their mouths. They didn't even make a mark against Daniel. Old king, he really liked Daniel, and he regretted having to be forced to place Daniel in the lion's den. He didn't sleep too well. Even though he had a king-size bed in the palace, I don't know if he had one or not, but he had a soft pillow, I'm sure. But that didn't give him sleep. Whereas he spent a sleepless night, Daniel, because God was near him, slept and pillowed his head upon all of those lions. What a great pillow that was. God was near Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. You know, they heated that furnace 7 times hotter. These men just would not bow down. They would not break. They would not do what the king said. When the music started, they were supposed to bow down to the image of Nebuchadnezzar, that golden image that was so tall and big and massive. So they just had him thrown in the prison, into the fire. And when the king rose up, it was his duty to always declare death. In this case, he was to see them burn up. But when he looked in the mouth of that furnace, he saw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and there was another person walking with them. And it was Jesus Christ. God was near Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. God was near Paul and Silas in the Philippian jail. At midnight, having been placed in the inner prison, been placed there for safekeeping until the next morning. If I were in that, I have claustrophobia. When I was a student at Red Mill, they found out that I can't stand tight places. Now, don't put me behind or close the door and lock it. Don't do that for me. I can't stand it. But those massive doors to the rooms in that old school building at Red Mill, they'd shove me behind the door and they'd hold it. I'd come over the top. I just can't stand close places. Claustrophobia. Well, in that inner prison, Paul and Silas, they were singing and praising God. I don't think I would have been able to do that. But the earthquake came and the prison was shaken, and the jailer, awakened out of his sleep, came and asked, "What must I do to be saved?" Paul was in a terrible storm on one occasion. The Bible says in Acts chapter 27, verses 22 through 25, that God was near. In fact, he told Paul, he said, "I want you to go back and tell the people that nobody's going to lose their life. The ship's going to be destroyed. The cargo is going to be in the water. Everything is going to look like a disaster, but everything will be all right. No life lost. You'll be able to get on the island." Paul went out there and he says, "It's been told me by God that no loss of life. The ship will be lost. Our cargo will be lost. Our suitcases will be destroyed. But we'll all be safe and sound. Because I believe that God, that it will be as He said." So where is God when I hurt? Sooner or later, we're all going to be tested. And are we going to have faith strong enough to believe that God is up in heaven on His throne, God is beside you, and that God is near you? God has given us much assurance by His presence, by His promises, by His peace that comes through the study of His Word, and above all, by providence, not miraculous, but providence. And really, when it comes to miraculous versus providence, I'd rather have providence. You don't always know when it's there, why it's there. But Romans 8:28, all things work together for good to them that love God. I may have missed the point tonight completely. You may have been bored with what I tried to say. But I spent my day talking to a person who constantly asks, where is God? Where is God in my life? I haven't seen him. I haven't felt him. I was hopeless in telling him that God's on his throne when he didn't believe really that there is a God who cares. And so tonight I hope that our faith is made a little bit stronger and that we can really come through all of our beatings. You know, those news people in Afghanistan, those people that have taken over that country beats those news people. And some of us have seen their backs as they've been beaten and so on. The devil likes to beat up Christians. He likes to make you weary. He likes to make you give up. But God is on his throne, and God is in control.